What is up? New year, new microphone. It's Jared Harris, and you're listening to Beats by Jer. Today, we're going to look back at some of the records that I thought made 2023 a special year for music. Consider this some sort of spiritual successor to episode 4, in which I looked at the first half of the year and some of the notable releases. If anything, I hope you walk away with a new album or artist that intrigues you, or at the very least, you revisit a gem that you simply didn't give enough time and attention to. I find that it's something that happens all too often with new music, particularly from artists you are familiar with. The new album comes out, you listen to it once, or even non-stop for a period, and then it springs the trap as you fall into the rabbit hole in which you revisit their older, more classic, not necessarily better, but more familiar and nostalgic works. And now perhaps this is one of the intended side effects of music consumption in 2023-24, especially for more established and legacy artists. The idea that new releases are a vehicle to ensnare listeners into streaming your back catalog. But this feels a little too cynical for me. And when that happens, I'd like to chalk that up to a happy accident. Regardless if intended or not, it happens all the time, and consequentially, we often neglect the new album, even if we loved it upon its release. For today's episode, I hope to focus on the albums that I loved, but most importantly, the ones which stuck with me throughout the year and feel just as exciting now, months later, as when they were first dropped. Let's first start with my Spotify Wrapped, an excellent way of actually looking at one's listening habits and, while not the be-all, end-all, shout out to my record collection. It's fun nonetheless. Of course, we have to congratulate Spotify for figuring it all out. Year after year, they're telling us that they're tracking 110% of what we do on their app, but they've turned it into this fun game that each and every one of us long for come late November, year after year. They cracked the code, they figured it out. They've done what Bezos and Zuckerberg and Google and any other ad-driven company cannot do. My 2023 listening was nothing surprising in the least. An equal split between rock and hip-hop with additional segments of modern hard rock, East Coast hip-hop, and alternative hip-hop. If we do away with the subgenres, it was primarily a rap sandwich. For those on Apple Music, the graphic was done as sort of a burger sandwich thing. I was described as a hypnotist listening to albums all the way through. My top artists were Queens of the Stone Age, Run the Jewels, Ghostface Killah, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Killer Mike. Not surprising. I can pinpoint the timelines in which each of these artists dominated my year. The Chili Peppers spilling over from Return of the Dream Canteen, released in the fall of 22, and then of course steady throughout the year. Run the Jewels a couple days a week for the gym, Ghostface in the spring, and Queens and Killer Mike throughout the summer and much of the rest of the year following their own releases. And of course, before we move on, I want to thank you all for continuing to listen to and support this podcast, my own creative exercise from 2023. Much to my own astonishment, Beats by Jer was a top 10 podcast for 54 listeners, a top 5 for 33 listeners, and a top 1 for a very special 22 of you. The fact that I am anyone's top 1 truly blows me away, and I cannot thank you enough for listening. And with that, let's begin with the most obvious record, Queens of the Stone Age in Times New Roman. I've talked a lot about this album, and if you're curious, I walked through the entire record on episode 7. This record felt like a return to form for Josh Homme and the band. I'll preface this by saying that I really enjoyed their previous 2 albums like Clockwork and Villains, but in Times New Roman felt like they had returned to their positions as alt-rock experimenters and pioneers. There is a reckless sense of danger to this record. Its teeth are sharp as they throw caution to the wind and indulge in a creative spree that somehow serves as the conclusion to the trilogy of records this iteration of the band has made, while also feeling nostalgic for the grit of their earlier work. Even upon returning to it after some time not listening to it, In Times New Roman was just as thrilling, an artistic statement that I believe will hold the test of time as the band pushes forward. Front to back, there is not a moment I skip on this album, but I would say that Obscenary, Negative Space, Paper Machete, and Sicily are defining moments on the album. Killer Mike's Michael. This album was monumental, almost cathartic for anyone who has followed Killer Mike's career from the beginning as a regular featured artist with Outkast. Songs like Snapping and Trapping and The Whole World are elevated from his presence, but also his solo material. Michael is his sixth solo record and follows a series of 4 stellar albums with ELP in Run the Jewels. Despite finding cult status through his work, Killer Mike really came to prominence through RTJ, but Michael is his most impressive independent statement to date. The album is largely autobiographical, looking at how he spent his career struggling and hustling within an industry that has constantly overlooked him, along with the recent loss of both his mom and grandmother and the African American experience. Through blending beats that are both organic and electronic, leaning on rap, funk, R&B, and gospel, the album is truly a celebration of Black excellence in spite of institutional, cultural, and industrial oppression. Besides, who else could have managed to get both Dave Chappelle and André 3000 featured on their album? Highlights include Down by Law, Run, and Rich, Talking That Shit, Scientists and Engineers, and Don't Let the Devil. While not on the album, it is worth noting the recently released and rearranged collaborative version of Run with Damian Marley is especially exceptional. Moving forward is a pair of albums from rival sons, Darkfighter and Lightbringer. This is a band that should be among the biggest rock bands of our time. Their music, their songwriting, their performance is masterful, and most impressively, they're clearly inspired by 70s rock without feeling derivative or half-baked, instead sounding fully formed, unique, and somehow modern. The 2 albums are an examination of the human condition, highlighting the tension we see daily in person and online, seeking for a space in which we can exist with our differing of opinions, beliefs, and values. Earlier this year, I had a fantastic conversation for The Spill magazine with their guitarist Scott Holliday about the first of the 2 releases, to which he said, "This record is a journey, and I want people to get lost in it. There should be some healthy escapism where they can relieve themselves from that. It should be reflective, something you can step into that will throw you into another world." Both records are very, very strong. However, something about Darkfighter draws me in more. Between the 2 albums, I would recommend listening to Mirrors, Nobody Wants to Die, Guillotine, and Mercy. Whatever you do, do not sleep on this band. We couldn't look at 2023 without talking about the Stones. The Originators returned with their first studio album of all new material in 18 years. Hackney Diamonds has it all, from featuring Elton John, Paul McCartney, to paying tribute to the late Charlie Watts. The album has a spark to it that most middle-aged artists struggle to capture, let alone a band of octogenarians. The album is triumphant, a true comeback, and in many ways, a spectacular way to bookend a truly unprecedented career, should this be their last record. Despite this likely being a conclusion, Hackney Diamonds is a defining moment and their greatest collection of work since 1978. If you want to hear more, hit up episode 13 where I discuss the album and its launch in detail. Key moments include Angry, Bite My Head Off, Live by the Sword, Tell Me Straight, Sweet Sounds of Heaven, and Rolling Stone Blues, a song which might be my favorite of the year if something like that could actually exist. As you know, I loved the unbridled creativity that was New Blue Sun, the first record from André 3000 and his first major release since 2006. This was the focus of the previous episode of this podcast. The album is teeming with creativity and experimentation for the very sake of it. It is zen, it is peaceful, and in many ways it is challenging. Like great art, it doesn't quite fit into any box, and it defies all convention of genre, style, and even fundamental concepts of melody, harmony, and rhythm. The more I sit with this album, somehow the more and less I understand about it, but the more I love it nonetheless. I think it is safe to say that André, after this release, after of course his contributions to hip hop with Outkast, but when we look at New Blue Sun, Andre 3000 can stand among the most creative figures ever with his latest album. This next record came to me as a pleasant surprise. Despite loving Deftones, I had never really been all that into Crosses, the alt-goth electronic project from lead vocalist Chino Marino. I'm not sure if it was just that I wasn't into their previous releases or if I hadn't given them enough time. But their newest album, Good Night, God Bless, I Love You, Delete, was a mesmerizing record that came from the recommendation of a friend of mine, Anthony Botting of the Cocktails. The album is pleasantly dissonant and nostalgic for Nine Inch Nails' The Downward Spiral. It's not quite industrial, but it teeters to that tone. The beats are cold yet lush. There is warmth, but a haunting nature to Chino's vocals, as anyone would come to expect at this point. The album is just such a different record from what you may expect from Deftones, and it was such a cool experiment, I think. And of course, this is more than like just a standoff, right? There are previous Crosses records which I am long overdue for diving deep into, but this record was so cool. Pleasure, Last Rites, Big Youth, which features ELP, all stand out as great songs. There's so much sleekness, so much raw, so much that's visceral to this album. It's a complete juxtaposition in tone in so many ways, but that's what makes it so unique and so riveting, I would say. Royal Blood released Back to the Water Below, a record which feels like a point of culmination that their previous two albums were hinting at, but just couldn't quite reach. The band has long strayed from their slinky but abrasive attack of their impressive debut, perhaps the most impressive debut effort of the last decade, for a more refined sense of songwriting. Back to the Water Below seems to find a sense of balance between these two ideas. From the fury of Mountains at Midnight to the Bond-esque Pull Me Through and the Ziggy Stardust-inspired There Goes My Cool, Back to the Waters Below is a very impressive album that captures the magic of Royal Blood's debut. The band has since, in like the last week of December or so, they released a bonus edition of the album in which there is the additional Supermodel Avalanches. On social media, the band stated that song has been kicking around for almost a decade, so it goes back to the first record or so, and they just haven't found a place to put it. And the song is as cool as the name is dumb. Supermodel Avalanches. It reminds me of Loose Change in that the song starts off at one speed and it grooves, and then about halfway through there's a break in the music and they come back with this instrumental double time thing that brings the song to a conclusion. It's really cool. It's explosive. It just sounds like Ben Thatcher and Mike Kerr are having a lot of fun in the studio, and it's a really cool song. It's a weird mix on an album like this, but nonetheless, I'm quite happy that it exists. Crownlands are the Canadian band to watch. Not a Canadian band, the Canadian band to watch. As someone that has been following them since their earliest releases in 2017, It is so unbelievably cool to have gone from seeing them in small clubs to opening for July Talk at Massey Hall. Their trajectory is unreal. It's incredibly well-deserved. Their latest album, Fearless, is a 70s prog rock album, but done right. I'm not a huge prog rock guy. And Crownlands have found this way of making me like prog. They're seemingly indulging in progressive stylings and somehow rejecting them at the same time. The album is just, it's a monster of a record. Between the 18-minute opener, Starlifter Fearless Part 2, and the Zeppelin-esque Lady of the Lake, Fearless is a powerful record that will leave you excited for what else has come from Canada's coolest duo. This band I cannot praise enough. Every release seems to build upon the last, and just it takes them off into new directions, and they never disappoint. Every release is just bigger, better, more exciting, and different from the last. Can't Find the Brakes from Dirty Honey. This is another 70s inspired rock band that defies all odds, and rather than sounding like they're playing to tired tropes, have revitalized the genre with what I think is their best album yet. Even more impressive, the band is entirely independent, touring the world, sharing the stage with the likes of Guns N' Roses, releasing charting records, and headlining theater-sized venues in international markets, all without a label. It's inspiring, and it's something that feels like it should be impossible. I saw the band headline the Danforth Music Hall, and what a performance. Mark LaBelle, what a voice, what an energy. The dude walked out in sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat and a poncho and was just effortlessly cool. He lost the poncho a few songs in, but kept the hat and shades on until like the very last song. And he was just so cool. A frontman truly pulled from a different era. Back to the record, Can't Find the Brakes is just great. While still playing to what their audience loves, the band is clearly expanding their songwriting. Check out Won't Take Me Alive, Ride On, and Coming Home, Ballad of the Shire. Big Wreck. A band I have always appreciated but never really got into until the last few years through my singer and my very good friend Mike Biase. Released Pages, their latest EP, their second EP of the year. The record follows a trio of EPs, the 7 series, and is the first of 3, as lead singer and guitarist Ian Thornley told me during my interview for The Spill magazine. Let's talk about Thornley for a moment. I caught the band at History last month, and the dude is untouchable. His vocals are reminiscent for Chris Cornell, a comparison I absolutely do not make lightly, and he's shredding on guitar like some of the greatest of legends. And to top it all off, near the end of the set, he apologized because he had a flu and he knew it wasn't sounding up to standard. I was blown away. I cannot wait to catch the band when he is healthy, but what a performance. Truly, Thornley is the most underrated singer and guitarist in rock. Pages. The record is experimental, fusing Zeppelin with Peter Gabriel-era Genesis, as the band employs progressive elements like longer songs, shifting structures, lengthy instrumental sections, all without feeling all that progressive. An example of this is the opening song, In Fair Light, a song which the introduction alone takes about 2 minutes. In addition to that track, Bail Out and Birds of Paradise are must-hear songs. Vicious Beasts, the new project from Monster Truck's John Harvey, released their debut, I Am Drugs. Similar in tone to Monster Truck, only heavier, grittier, and far darker. The album feels like stripped down, bare bones hard rock, ripe with reckless abandon and soaring vocals. I want to take a moment to give a shout out to my friend Mike Penny of the Jailbirds for laying down some incredible guitar work on this one. If you only listen to a few songs, I Am the Night, Howl at the Moon, Sex Magic, and Sleepwalker are where it's at. I feel like this project was Harvey's excuse to write and perform more, but also return to the dive bars and clubs he once cut his teeth on. Having caught them at the Bovine Sex Club, I'm so glad that he did. The last record that I want to talk about from 2023 is Remember Never Before from July Talk. This is the Toronto band who made it out of the city onto a national and an international stage as alternative icons. I like the band. I enjoyed their previous record, but I had never quite gotten it. Remember Never Before was the album that made it all click. There was that moment I was sitting there watching the band perform at Massey Hall last year, shortly after the album came out, and between the new record, between watching them perform, between my conversation with Danny Miles, their drummer, for episode 5, between all of this, I got it. I had that moment, and suddenly I went from enjoying July Talk to loving the band. And this record feels like they've reached that point that they've been trying to reach their entire career. There is raw and visceral, attacking tones mixed with incredibly melodic and lush and soft harmonies. And musically, it's incredibly modern alternative rock that's inspired by the likes of like Bowie and alternative hip hop and 70s blues rock and Queens of the Stone Age. There's so much going on. The tight rhythms between the drum and bass, they almost lock in like beats, like electronic beats for the lead lines and vocals to play over. The chemistry between the two singers is unparalleled. And the record is just, it's as refined as it is raw. It is such an interesting and unique release. And I would highly recommend listening to the opening track after this and the closing track, I Am Water. These are must-hear tracks, but everything else in between, you'll be better off for hearing it. I would like to take a moment to send a shout out to some of my friends, an honorable mention, if you will. The Jailbirds, Cigar Club, Harmonies, Revive the Rose, Mono Whales, Taming Sorry, Mobius Radio, Queens and Kings, Amy Gaba and the Almost Famous, Fortunate Losers, and Cold Weather Captains for releasing some great music, singles, albums, and EPs that I could really vibe to this year. It was a really cool time for independent Toronto and Ontario-based music. Check them out, catch a show, tell them I sent you. And there you have it. Those were some of the coolest albums from 2023 that have stuck with me beyond their initial release. Did I miss something? Let me know in the comments what new album you couldn't get enough of this year. Tune in 2 weeks for a very special episode featuring none other than Anthony Botting, lead vocalist and guitarist of The Cocktails, discussing their upcoming album, Triangle. I'm Jared Harris, and this is Beats by Jer.